My name is Jonathan. I'm one of the pastors here. And if you thought you had a bad day, think of this woman. She was minding her own business. She did not want to be noticed. And yet she was scooped up by the religious authorities. Have you ever felt like you're only getting part of the story? Go with that feeling. Have you ever felt like something was happening before this that we might need to notice? Go with that feeling where we swoop in with Jesus, like a camera swooping in. We join Jesus in the middle of something else. So we need to back up and find out what's going on, because context matters. We join Jesus. He is in Jerusalem. He's there for the festival of the booths, or the Feast of the Tabernacles, or the Feast of the Booths, or the Festival of that part, it's a commanded by God holiday. It's a remembrance. It's when gratitude is offered to God who provides what people need. Comes out of the Exodus, but we'll get to that in a second. Jesus is in the temple courtyard. He is amid a very large crowd, and he stands up and in a very loud voice proclaims, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink." Jesus is not just pulling words out of the air. He is referencing two Old Testament passages, the bookends of the Exodus experience. The first one comes out of Exodus 17. The Israelites have just escaped slavery in Egypt. They've just crossed the Red Sea, and they're kind of limping and hobbling because that's a lot of walking to do, and they've been enslaved. And the Amalekites come out of nowhere and attack them and try to exploit them. The Amalekites come and are defeating them, and it is only by divine intervention that the Israelites survive. God intercedes, God provides a way forward. That's Exodus 17, kind of the beginning of the wilderness experience. Numbers 20 is the other passage where that Jesus is referencing as he says those words. They've been wandering in the wilderness for more than one generation, whole generation, 40 years. They're almost to the promised land, and the water runs out. There is no water, and God provides water from a rock, a stone. God provides what people need. That's what the Festival of Booths is about. It's waiting for God to provide what people need. This is important because that's what all of these people are doing in Jerusalem. They've pilgrimed, they've come, they're in the middle of this festival, this feast. And these source texts are referenced by Jesus. Gratitude for God. God provides what people need. Jesus applies these words, this idea, to himself. That's a heck of a thing to say. I am the truth, the light, and the way. Yes, that's fine. I am water. Come to me and drink. This is huge. Jesus applies this to himself. The religious authorities don't like him. They're threatened by his popularity with people, and they come at him. They see an opportunity. They don't like Jesus. They try to arrest Jesus in the temple area for blasphemy. Nobody claims God is on their side, but Jesus just did. They try to arrest him. They can't do it. The crowds are too big, and they like Jesus too much. The religious authorities recognize if we try to cuff him, the crowd is going to go wild and defend him. They can't do it, so they retreat. And then they plan together like religious politicians do. He's too popular. They have to plan carefully. The Festival of Booths, the Feast of Tabernacles, comes for 7 days. It lasts for 7 days. In the Torah, the book of Numbers, chapter 29, it tells us that the day after the Feast of Booths will be kept as a day of Sabbath. No work is permitted on that day. This is important. So they get through the Feast of Booths. The religious leaders have been planning and conspiring like religious people are wont to do. And that festival day, the Sabbath day after the feast has ended, comes. Early in the morning, Jesus is in the temple area. That's where we pick up. He comes into the temple area and he begins to teach. The religious authorities have been waiting for this moment because crowds are now gathering. And a large crowd is a necessity. Why? There has to be a crowd because the religious authorities are going to try to trap Jesus on a question of interpreting the Torah. They've decided to humiliate Jesus in public over a question about the law of Moses, the Torah. And if they can humiliate him, if they can catch him in a bind, if they can get him over a barrelhead, on the interpretation of the Torah, it will demonstrate to the crowd, the fickle crowd, that Jesus is not a reliable interpreter of the Torah. The crowd will leave him, will not like him anymore, and they'll come back to us. This is the thinking of the religious authorities. This is the plan, and there is no escape. They bring a woman to Jesus. They're saying, we caught her in adultery. Just one thing. The law of Moses requires both the woman and the man to be brought for judgment. And the law of Moses goes on and says that without both the woman and the man, it is not appropriate to judge for adultery, and stoning is out of the question. Jesus could call them on that. He could argue that point with them. He does not. The other option here, they've got a sole woman, no man, who they've caught in committing adultery. How does a religious professional catch a woman committing adultery all by herself? The other option that has been put out there is that this woman is a known prostitute who's trying to make ends meet. And visiting a prostitute, according to the Torah, visiting a prostitute is shameful, but it's not an act of adultery. Which means that this is either an inappropriate application of the law of Moses, trying to judge a woman solely for being caught committing adultery, or it's a false accusation accusing a woman who's a known prostitute for being an adulteress. Isn't moralism funny? They say to Jesus, the law of Moses says to stone her, give us a ruling, which puts Jesus in a real pickle. Here's why. When Herod built the temple in Jerusalem, it's about 35 acres, he also built a balcony around 3 sides, so a wall around 3 sides with a balcony up on it, and up on this balcony, Roman soldiers would patrol. And then on the 4th side, he put a Roman army barracks. So right there at the temple, there would always be a garrison of Roman soldiers. Why did Herod do this? Well, because when trouble broke out, it always seems to have broken out at the temple. People would be together, somebody'd start talking, somebody'd start yelling, and the crowd would get out of hand, turn into a mob. About 20 years before this, our text today, about 20 years before this, a Roman soldier made an obscene gesture to the crowd. The crowd turned into a mob, the crowd rioted, and it took about 2 months to get things calmed down. Herod wanted troops, Roman troops, right there to flow into the temple courtyard and seize control of any situation. The Romans also said about this issue of stoning, this little habit that you have of a crowd grabbing someone, determining that they're guilty, and stoning them in public. Yeah, you're not going to do that anymore. Life and death is in our hands. We're the Romans. Life and death is in the hands of the Roman legal system. And so, if Jesus says to the religious authorities who have brought this woman, if he says to them, fine, stone her, he's going to get arrested. If he says, gentlemen, you know, it's the law of Moses and we all love Moses, but let's have a little realism here. I mean, for heaven's sake, can't you see the Romans up on the top there watching us? I mean, we live in a situation of military oppression, and we do hope, of course, for the day in which we will be free to observe the law of Moses in the strictest fashion of, oh, how long, O Lord, must your people suffer under the repressive, but how long, O Lord, until we're liberated? Jesus can make a really nice patriotic speech. He can get himself off the hook. But that means he's chicken. He's not willing to apply the law of Moses when it costs him something. They have set a very good trap. So what does he do? Well, the text tells us that Jesus then bends down and he begins to write in the dust with his finger. And in doing so, he is communicating two things very clearly to everyone who is watching him. The first thing that he's communicating is that he knows where he is and what role he is in. These religious authorities have brought this woman to Jesus. They have demanded that he become the judge. And when he squats down to write in the dust, he says, I have become the judge. And here's how we know that. In Judea, Judea was a province of the Roman Empire, and a Roman judge would hear the case and then would write their judgment on a wax tablet and then hand that to the bailiff of the court to be read after the judge has relinquished control. In other words, once it's written, that's the judgment. And you can yell and scream and holler all you want that you don't like the judgment the judge has offered, but it's too late. The judgment is given. It's all been written. We know this because we see this in the execution of Jesus. When the religious leaders protest to Pilate about placing a sign over Jesus on the cross that says, Jesus is the King of the Jews, Pilate responds, what I have written is written. By writing in the dust, Jesus is saying, I know where I am, and I know that I am the judge in this moment. That's the first thing he's communicating. The second thing that Jesus is communicating by writing in the dust, the Old Testament and the Mishnah are very clear. The Mishnah is the small print for the rabbis. The Old Testament and the Mishnah, the Torah and the Mishnah are both very clear that you are not allowed to work on the Sabbath. Remember, this is a Sabbath day after the Festival of Booths. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. The Mishnah lays all of this out, and almost verbatim, we can repeat this. The rabbis were asked the question, fine, we're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. What is work? The rabbis looked and they worked on it and they came back with a list of 39 things that constitute work. One of them is writing. What is writing? Writing is when you put ink on paper. Well, what if I'm not using paper and I don't have any ink? I'm just down at the market and I want to buy some produce and I need to do a little bit of math to make sure I have enough money with me, and I do this in the dust with my finger. Am I writing? No, because writing is putting ink on paper. Am I breaking the law? You are not breaking the law. Jesus writes in the dust with his finger. He is communicating on the Sabbath. He is communicating to the religious leaders without words. Not only do I understand the law of Moses, but I also understand the fine print which has developed in the rabbinic circles. In other words, he is worthy to be the judge. But what does he write? If we pay attention to the text, I think it's rather clear what he writes. Jesus is stepping into a trap set by religious authorities. They're trying to get him to play soft in the application of the law of Moses, which very clearly says that people caught committing adultery are to be stoned. And if he lets her off the hook, they got him. They win. He loses. It's clear to me exactly what Jesus wrote in the dust. They've made him the judge. He's passing judgment. He wrote one of three things. He either wrote hamaut, death, or rahuma judnin, which means stone with stones, or he wrote kakala, kill. They presume that he is judging her. Remember, these religious authorities have either inappropriately applied the law of Moses by subjecting only the female offender to the rule about adultery and have brought her for judgment and punishment, or they have falsely accused a prostitute of committing adultery. Deuteronomy 19 spells out very clearly the consequences for bringing false accusation, particularly if your intention is to get somebody stoned to death. Deuteronomy 19 says, "You shall do to the accuser what they intended to have happen to their subject by making the false accusation." So in this situation, Deuteronomy 19 is very clear that these religious authorities, having violated the law of Moses with false accusations against this woman, are to be stoned without mercy. The next movement in our text, the next movement is the response of the religious leaders, which, since they are not alarmed, confirms that Jesus, kneeling down, wrote words of judgment in the dust, which they have continued to apply to her. The text says they continued to ask Jesus, "Shall we stone her?" After being made judge and writing his judgment in the dust, Jesus rises and answers their question. Yes, and the one without sin shall cast the first stone. We read this, and our interpretation has been, aha! He's getting them by pointing out that they are sinful too. And that is what keeps them from throwing stones. Their realization that they are as sinful as she is. But that's not what's happening. That's not what is happening in the text. Having a double standard does not concern these guys. Think about every religious person who's decided to judge someone else that you have ever known. Does having a double standard bother overly exuberant religious people? No, it does not. What keeps them from throwing stones is not their sin. It's the Roman soldiers on the balcony above. When the stoning begins, the soldiers are going to stream out into the courtyard. They're going to secure the situation, and the first question is going to be, all right, who started this? And now there are two names on the list. Jesus ordered it, and old sinless threw the first stone. Two people would go to jail. Until very recently, mobs were anonymous. It is simply not possible to arrest 2,000 people. This permitted people to be very bold about tearing things up, setting things on fire. Mobs could overrun and burn and kill and fade away into a crowd. And Jesus, just like that, puts a name and a face on every one of these religious leaders in the crowd. He says to them, you caught her. You've determined she's guilty. Fine. You want me to go to jail for the law of Moses? I'm ready to go. Which one of you stoners is going with me? Everybody instinctively turns and looks at the most senior of the religious authorities to see if he has the guts to do it. And after thinking it over for a moment, he says, some other time, please. Their trap, which they were absolutely sure would spring and Jesus would be publicly humiliated, has been sprung. And it is they who are publicly shamed. And as they walk away, Jesus bends down again and begins writing in the dust. He's continuing to message everyone in the crowd who is watching him. As part of their plan to trap and humiliate Jesus, they made him the judge, and he, as a good judge, has exposed the truth for everyone to see. And the truth is, as much as religious leaders like to judge others, religious people are not willing to apply that same standard when it costs them something. And it has still not occurred to these religious leaders that by making Jesus to be the judge, his first judgment would be of them. Isn't moralism funny? As they depart, he writes his judgment in the dust. And it's clear to me that he writes one of three things. He either writes diabolos, which means the false accuser or the devil, or hypocrites, which is hypocrites, or necros, already dead. The religious men are gone. Think about the woman. The text makes the point that Jesus stood up to address her. He's no longer writing in the dust. He's no longer the judge. He says to her, is there no one left to condemn you? She says, no one, sir. He says, neither do I condemn you. He never did. Jesus is telling her exactly who he is. He is not her accuser. He is not her judge. He is her friend. He is her advocate. Jesus is also telling her exactly who she is. She's the valued recipient of his gift, her life. And the story ends with Jesus offering a commentary on her life. He says to her, "Go and sin no more," which we hear as just a little dig on this woman. Straighten up, stop screwing up. I let you off the hook this time, but that's how we read it, which is an incorrect reading. Because to read it that way makes Jesus into her accuser and her condemner, who then lets her off the hook. And it also feeds the idea that sin, her sin, diminishes her value, separates her from God. It means the religious men that brought her for stoning were right in their judgment of her. So our read of this is incorrect. The correct read would be that the sin of the woman is allowing herself to be defined by the men who condemned her. Their purpose was asserting their power to define her. They attacked a vulnerable person. Her sin is allowing herself to believe that anything she has done could separate her from God's intervention and grasp and love and care. Jesus is saying to this woman, stop believing the nonsense that came out of their mouths. Because not only is it not true, but it's a sin. You are created and valued by your God. And it's a sin to believe that anything comes between us and God. Believing that allows us to diminish human value as an excuse for destroying people. If we can just find their sin and name it publicly, well, then we got them. This is the sin of religious authority. This is the sin of those who brought the woman for judgment. And they're gone, and Jesus is left. She begins to breathe again. 4 minutes ago, she was pretty sure she'd be dead by now. And she knows the quickest way to get into trouble is to humiliate powerful people in public. She says to herself, this is round one. These were very powerful people. They will be back, and they will bring a bigger stick. Jesus is going to get hurt because of what he did for me. She will be able to say for the rest of her life, Jesus gave his life for me. We leave Jesus in Jerusalem following the festival of booths. People have pilgrimed. They are expressing gratitude that God intervenes and provides what people need. Go your way and sin no more.
and see how gracious the Lord is. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. Oh, taste and see how gracious the Lord is. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him. Blessed is the man that trusteth in him.
Would you stand for the benediction, and we will remain standing for our closing hymn. Take a deep breath and go into the world expecting to be different than the world. You were not called to fit in. You're called to be different. Go and be.